Thank you so much, and welcome back to our continued coverage here at the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry, and the importance of having these discussions with industry, institutional experts is for us to be able to see the evidence that we're listening to and hearing in the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry in its bigger context. Now, here's an important stat to consider, is that in South Africa, the ratio of security or security officers to actual police officers is an estimated 3-to-1 or 4-to-1, an estimated 600,000 security officers in the South African space, compared to 140 to 153,000 active SAPS members. Now that stat becomes germane, Eldred, when you think about the security companies mentioned at the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry who've suddenly found themselves in the middle of police business, the latest of which is Steve Motsumi, a Bedford View businessman who is also the owner of a company called Vazwini Securities, who is mentioned in Witness F's testimony, not to mention as well Cat Matlala's Cat Securities enterprise. So talk to us about mission creep here.
Well, we ended 2025 with expressing concern about how security companies are not only acting like, but actively pursuing the responsibilities given to a public institution like the South African Police Service. They are adopting the regalia, they're adopting the methods, and they're actively recruiting and hiring people trained at public cost to bolster their security efforts. There's two components to this. One is the increased privatization of policing, of public policing, and as public service, which is a public enterprise. And secondly, the assuming of responsibilities which should be in the public domain, especially the guarding of public information. So we should be concerned about who's doing our forensic testing. We should be concerned about who's undertaking surveillance, for example. We are often giving over information. We're not sure how that information has been secured, what that information has been used for. And this relationship between the South African Police Service and the private security sector has to be not only managed properly, but it also shouldn't be entered into simply because we lack capability and capacity within the South African police. They cannot augment the police by becoming the police.
And here's the thing, in Witness F's testimony, right, there were admissions of him sending things like finger processing images, other police-related information to this particular Motsumi, but he said it was casual, it wasn't harmful, but there is that creep that you're talking about, which is something that we should be incredibly disturbed about as South Africans.
Absolutely, because they undertaking joint operations, you still need to stay in your lane. You still need to be wary and concerned to follow protocols and instruction as to who get access to what information. Because whether we like it or not, public security companies are not accountable to a public institution like Parliament, for example, or the Civilian Secretariat, or the General, the Inspector General of Intelligence, for example. So you cannot casually, simply because of this notion of force multiplier, where you say, I need them to work alongside me, casually dispense of information, operational plans, tactical considerations, but also are we then going to start saying who are suspects, how cases are developing, because that undermines the integrity, not only of police investigations, but it can undermine the integrity of evidence, it can compromise evidence, and essentially then allow a case to fail. And this is what the concern is with this infiltration of not only criminal cartels, but also this nefarious relationships that is happening between security companies and the South African Police Service.
I mean, I was going to go into some of the detail of Witness F's statement, but I think I'm just going to comment on that and then ask you to talk about the institutions. In his testimony, there were these communications between him and Sibiya Mabuza, for example, around his office offer for the 750 compact 12-gauge shotguns with ammunition for them to be tested and so on. He said the deal didn't proceed, and of course the Commission said that his evidence was evasive and contradictory. The interesting thing that all of this testimony cumulatively is showing us is the contestation inside various police departments, but also the contestation across the enforcement complex, whether it is crime detection, whether it is crime investigation, whether it is IDAC, whether it is the DPCI. What are you reading in the tea leaves here?
Well, we keep talking about factions as if it's between individuals, but it's also between missions and mandates. It's also about capability. It's also about component heads within the South African Police Service and components contesting for ground they should all be working in, and they should be working collaboratively. So the concern is, are we now seeing a rehashing of what happened to the then Scorpions, for example? Are we seeing that this is an attack on DPCI? Are we seeing that IDAC and their capability within the Justice Department has been undermined? Because you cannot simply say that it's individuals that are of concern. The concern is that when you have so many investigative units, what it does do is that it scatters, it thins out, and it compromises investigations because these units seemingly are not working collaboratively. They seem not to understand that they're the same institution, and yet they're duplicating efforts, and we're not seeing the fruits of those duplicated efforts.
And without oversight, there's the potential for them to go rogue, because shouldn't this have been a red flag? I mean, a private citizen in possession, allegedly, of this massive cache of arms and armaments, reaching out to a police officer who should have red flagged this, have done something about it, even if a so-called deal didn't go through, allegedly. Where are the problems here that went unchecked, Eldred?
Well, the red flag has been always that the private security companies can outgun and outstaff and have greater capability than a South African police service. And we saw that when we looked at how CAT supposedly had resources that they could make available
in Ekurhuleni,
yeah,
so this is
exactly.
Vusimuzi Cat Matlala.
So we saw it across the board. And the concern we have here, Iman, is ultimately, as you were saying, the red flags are there because there's a lack of governance. There's a lack of not just leadership, but actually management of this. And that we've seen capable officers who's good at their job, but are not necessarily good administrators, nor are they good management. Because we see there's a difference between my tactical acumen and my ability to do my job as an investigator. Then I get to a certain rank, but now I have to assume additional responsibilities, and that is to manage budgets, to manage processes and procedures, and to account and govern and on a daily basis lead a particular unit, which may not be my strength. My strength is that of an investigator, which is why the National Development Plan argues for two streams: a management stream with people dedicated to ensure that officers are resourced, that officers are supported, and that there's good governance of this public institutions. And then the other competent professional stream, where you have competent ethical officers who can focus squarely on their job. But we haven't seen that divide.
And it connects to the very basics of policing, and I'm just going to use an anecdote here to illustrate the point. When I opened a fraud case at the Sea Point police station in December, it took the officer that was taking my statement down almost an hour to take down a simple affidavit, riven with spelling mistakes and conceptual inconsistencies with what I was basically relating about my incident. And it made me realize that even at a very functional and basic level, that support that police officers should get in writing up affidavits, which are the genesis of a case that will then stand up or fall down in court, isn't there. When there's that lack of oversight and professionalism of the service, it affects South African life in very real ways.
Absolutely, and we can't go from 2 years training of a candidate officer under the supervision of a field training officer to a 6 months training of a candidate officer who then is supposed to be under the supervision of a field training officer. We're not seeing consistency when it comes to that. In fact, what we're seeing is an erosion of, and The impact of this, Iman, essentially, is that that officer, you felt frustrated. I bet you that that officer equally felt the frustration because he or she must have known that they're not serving you in the best way possible. So if you then felt that, how does that officer's confidence feel? And how do they feel about the job and the service that they're rendering? They cannot surely be feeling good about it because they are acutely aware that they are being failed and they in turn are failing you, leaving them equally demoralized.
And it's important to raise that because even though we're talking about the evidence submitted at the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry at a very high level, there's this corrosive element around the lack of insight, around the lack of focus on actual policing tasks, the agenda of the police enforcement complex being hijacked by political and other influences, as we're hearing here. This is not just about a few officers. How much impact do you think, based on everything that you've heard so far, this is having on policing in general across all of these units in South Africa?
Well, what we're seeing is an institutional collapse, and that may sound dramatic, but ultimately we're hearing recurring stories of people feeling they've been underserved as individuals, they've been underserved in their areas, and we understand the frustrations of the day-to-day police officer who feels that they are not necessarily being supported, resourced, and they are not functionally being led with a clear policing doctrine and governance. Crime combating is not the stance of the South African Police Service. In fact, that's contrary to the stance of the South African Police Service. It's crime prevention and also the mitigation and management and investigation. Ultimately, that has to happen. That leadership is absent. And in fact, it puts undue stress on the system, and it's a system that's failing itself.
And thanks for that analysis, Eldred. In the 8 o'clock hour, Arabile, we will talk about the action that's now been taken by the President to create this task team to already begin to deal with the interim commission report at the Madlanga Commission around particular figures, and whether that's the right route to go based on everything that we're hearing, and whether that list is just going to get fatter and fatter and fatter.